strike is off. Junior doctors buckle under pressure from the public and threats that they would be held responsible if patients come to harm. Good evening. The country was bracing itself for the longest and most crippling NHS strike in history. 5 days from next Monday with a promise of repeat performances every month till Christmas. Now the British Medical Association has called off the first strike amid accusations that it was too much industrial action too soon. A growing backlash from a public facing tens of thousands of cancelled operations and threats that striking doctors could be struck off the medical register if patients come to harm. Next week's strike may be off. 15 strike days before Christmas are still very much in the diary. How will the government respond?
Also on tonight's programme, grip and grin and bear it. After the Brexit vote, Theresa May faces an uphill struggle to win friends and influence world leaders at her first international summit as PM. We're live in Calais as farmers, lorry drivers, even the police blockade the Channel Tunnel to try and force the French government to keep its promises to close the refugee camp there. And just another day at the office for the Labour MP embroiled in allegations about male escorts. He tried to shrug off questions about his future by quizzing his colleagues in the Commons. His MP sister's face said it all.
Name-calling, awkward stares and discrimination are already part of daily reality for people with disabilities. When it comes to crime, a new report out tomorrow reveals that disabled people are more worried about being victims of all crime, especially if they're younger than 24. The latest in our No Go Britain series.
People doing double takes, kind of nudging each other and pointing or shouting things like, you know, oh, that woman makes me want to vomit.
Junior doctors' leaders have agreed to call off next week's planned 5-day strike in England. The British Medical Association's announcement came after an intervention from the General Medical Council, which had warned that patients could be put at risk. The Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, welcomed the suspension of the first strike, but said that 3 other planned 5-day shutdowns before Christmas would be the most extreme actions ever seen in the NHS. Our health and social care correspondent, Victoria MacDonald, has this report.
Save our NHS! Save our NHS!
Less than a week ago, the British Medical Association announced a level of industrial action by doctors never seen before in this country.
Really, we were left with no other choice today than to take further industrial action.
5-day strikes once a month till the end of the year. But today they called off the first of the strikes due to begin next Monday amid concerns over patient safety. The announcement followed a meeting between NHS England and the BMA today in which both sides agreed that less than a fortnight's notice just wasn't enough time for the health service to prepare. But it also, as I understand it, follows intensive lobbying over the weekend of the Junior Doctors Committee by their grassroots members who were telling them that they were finding it difficult to justify this industrial action at such short notice. This afternoon, the chair of the Junior Doctors Committee said, for the first time in this dispute, NHS England have told us that a service under such pressure cannot cope with the notice period for industrial action given. Our hospitals are chronically understaffed. Our NHS is desperately underfunded. We have to listen to our colleagues when they tell us that they need more time to keep patients safe. The following dates in October, November and December will, however, go ahead as planned unless, the BMA said, the Health Secretary lifts his threat to impose the new contract.
Secretary Jeremy Hunt.
This evening, he remained firm.
It is deeply perplexing for patients, NHS leaders and indeed the government that the reaction of the BMA leadership who previously supported this contract is now to initiate the most extreme strike action in NHS history, inflicting unprecedented misery on millions of patients up and down the country.
Until now, there has been strong public support for the junior doctors and from senior colleagues, but there were fears this escalation risked a backlash, with some saying the strikes were disproportionate. Today, the General Medical Council warned that if patients did come to harm during the strikes, doctors could be disciplined. During the past 5 strikes, operations and outpatient appointments were cancelled and consultants filled the gaps in the rotas. But it was not clear that the NHS could guarantee putting consultants into place at such short notice and over a 5-day period. And there were warnings too that 100,000 operations and 1 million outpatient appointments would need to be postponed or cancelled.
Well, joining me now is the junior doctor, Fiona Martin, who is a medical registrar at Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital. Thanks for coming on the programme, Fiona. So what persuaded you in the end to back down? Was it the backlash from the public? Was it the threat of being struck off the medical register if something went wrong with patients? Was it lack of pay?
You know, it was none of those things, really. The fact is that these strikes were called with a sense of urgency. It gave the requisite 7-day legal warning that we were going to be withdrawing our labour. The BMA has very robust local structures in place, allowing grassroots doctors to communicate upwards. And grassroots doctors have said within their departments they don't feel that there's the capacity to make things safe.
So this is about preparation time, basically.
This is about preparation time to make things safe in our absence. And the BMA executive have listened to the grassroots doctors. Also trying to help NHS England and the GMC were saying that the hospitals weren't ready.
So to be clear, you are intending, or you would be in support of going ahead with the other 3 to 5 day lots of strikes planned until Christmas?
I think
15 more days of strikes.
Every single doctor is hoping that none of those strikes will happen. Whilst the threat of imposition of a contract that will cause serious patient harm is looming over us, we're still going ahead with those days, but we will take every single day as it comes, and I am hoping that none of us will have to be back out on the picket. But
there was a public backlash here, wasn't there? The public did not like the idea of tens of thousands of cancelled operations, more than 1 million appointments cancelled, 5-day strikes, historic in the NHS. They didn't like that.
Well, I think actually public support has remained strong. There was an ITV poll demonstrating that there was good public support. 85% of people still backing junior doctors, and ultimately in 2014 to 2015, tens of thousands of operations were cancelled because of chronic understaffing and a lack of beds. No one wants to inflict harm. Nobody wants operations to be cancelled. Ultimately, it would be a fraction of what we're already suffering because of the systematic policies which are handicapping our position in the NHS.
But it does sound as if your campaign is crumbling, that this is the beginning of the end for you.
Not at all. This isn't at all. This is us demonstrating that as opposed to people in Westminster, we can listen. We've heard what grassroots doctors are saying. We've heard the GMC. We've heard NHS England. We know our hospitals aren't ready. I'm not surprised in a way. They're already functioning with one hand tied behind their back because they're chronically understaffed and underfunded. We're going ahead. We are going ahead. Resolve hasn't changed. The strength of
Will you talk to Jeremy Hunt? Now?
We would love to talk to Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy Hunt, doesn't want to talk to us, but there is a door that is wide open. We sat outside the Department of Health for weeks on end trying to talk to him, and he walked straight past us.
What about accusations of bullying inside there was one doctor who resigned at the weekend, Lottie Elliott, resigned from the Committee of Junior Doctors on the GMA because she said she was being bullied into something that she was against.
I think it's incredibly sad that any doctor is stepping out of the union. Many, many more are stepping out of their careers. I'm not inside the BMA executive. I don't know what happens. I can only speak for myself, and I certainly feel no sense of bullying. People have been very supportive of those who want to strike and those who don't feel that they can strike. The fundamental thing is, as a profession, we are unified against imposition of a contract that is both unsafe and unfair.
OK. Dr. Fiona Martin, thank you very much indeed. And we asked Jeremy Hunt for an interview. The Secretary of State, he wasn't available, sadly. Cathy.
Thanks, Matt. Now, Brexit campaigners from the Foreign Secretary down had touted an Australian-style system as the best way to allow Britain to control immigration. Today, though, the Prime Minister flatly rejected such an approach, but she insisted new controls will be introduced on those coming in from Europe. Speaking at the end of the G20 summit in Hangzhou, Theresa May has been talking up the UK's relationship with other countries around the world, not least with China. Our political editor Gary Gibbon reports from Hangzhou.
Getting this relationship right is seen as one of the most important bits of a leader's job these days. But just before her meeting with China's President Xi, Theresa May downplayed a rethink she's launched on whether she'd let China build a nuclear reactor in Britain. She said Britain's relationship with China was about more than the nuclear deal. President Xi may see it differently. But it's the implications of Brexit that have dominated Theresa May's first summit experience. At her press conference, she denied claims she was backsliding on immigration by opposing the Brexit campaigners' favourite policy of bringing in an Australian points-based system.
What the British people voted for on the 23rd of June was to bring some control into the movement of people from the European Union into the UK. A points-based system does not give you that control. I want a system where the government is able to decide who comes into the country. I think that's what the British people want. A points-based system means that people come in automatically if they just meet the criteria.
At the end of last night's talks, China ferried the G20 leaders to a music and light spectacular. Theresa May's central mission here has been to tell the world that the Brexit vote doesn't mean Britain is turning in on itself. It's still an outward-looking world player, pro-free trade, and hoping to sign new trade agreements around the world when the Brexit deal is done. In the conference centre, Theresa May has been surrounded by world leaders who, on the whole, President Putin, the obvious exception, wanted Britain to stay inside the EU. And nearly all of them want Britain post-Brexit to have as close a relationship with the EU as possible. The Japanese government particularly outspoken on that while Theresa May's been here. But Theresa May knows that when she gets back to Britain, an awful lot of voters would like her to prioritise controlling immigration from the EU, even if that means some pain for the economy. In that room, most of the G20 leaders would appear to think it would be a good idea for Britain to stay in the single market. Is it one of the big worries of your new job that you might harm the economy by satisfying voters' urges to control immigration?
I intend to go out there and be ambitious. And I think there is a benefit, not just for the United Kingdom, of a good deal in trade and goods and services, but a benefit for Europe as well.
Although some in Whitehall have said Britain will formally move Article 50, triggering Brexit talks in January or February next year, Theresa May today took care to keep her options open. G20 leaders, some with their partners posing for the cameras. These wider meetings of world leaders started 8 years ago under the shadow of the banking crisis and have seen regular calls for world economic stimuli. This time, officials say, there was more talk of what the Australian Prime Minister called civilising capitalism, and what Theresa May said were much-needed attempts to limit over-the-top pay and tax avoidance. There had been hopes that President Obama and President Putin might announce a joint initiative here to stem the violence in Syria. They did meet, but there was no breakthrough. Theresa May's officials said she was the hot ticket at this summit, world leaders queuing up to make her acquaintance. The truth is, at these sorts of gatherings, the leader of China is nearly always one of the hottest tickets in town. The world's superpower that now demands respect, and which much of the rest of the world is struggling to come to terms with. A big part of the responsibility for the relationship with China soon falls on the shoulders of a new US president. And who gets that job later this year could determine what sort of terms the world leaders are speaking on when next they meet. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, at the G20 summit in Hangzhou.
Well, among the post-Brexit challenges facing Theresa May is how to keep foreign investors in Britain. The Japanese government has warned that its firms may relocate to mainland Europe if tariff-free arrangements were to disappear. Our correspondent Andy Davis has spent the day in Swindon, where 55% voted for Brexit, to see whether locals believe it could be a threat to the Honda car plant, which provides so many jobs in their town.
When it comes to Japanese firms investing in the UK, Swindon has long featured prominently on the map. Honda's been here for 30 years now, employs over 3,500 people, and says the company remains committed to its UK operations. But with the Japanese government issuing warnings over what Brexit could mean for Japanese firms in the UK, are people here worried? Some certainly, but most we met didn't appear at all troubled. Your husband works at the Honda factory.
Yeah, yes, he does. Yes.
Are you worried about the future of a plant like that when the Japanese government are clearly a bit nervous about what Brexit
My
could mean?
attitude is what will be, to be honest with you. And
I mean, it's going to take 2.5 years, supposedly, to even come out of the European Union, isn't it? It's not going to happen tomorrow. And I think in 2 years' time, all this nervousness will calm down. Personally, that's what I think.
Yeah, I suppose people could be worried in Swindon. But there again, it's going to cost an awful lot of money to relocate 2, 3 or 4 Japanese car factories, surely, even if they go somewhere else within Europe.
Do you know the Japanese government has been saying...
Oh, I know. They're threatening us at the moment, aren't they? Because they've got so many industries here.
Big industry here in Swindon.
And Honda, yeah, in Swindon.
Would you be worried about that for the...
Well, I am
for a
concerned
place
because
like
my son-in-law actually works for Swindon, for Honda.
Away from the economy, immigration remains an area where Brexit means something yet to be fully defined. But what we do know now is that there won't be an Australian-style points-based system to control it. A system whereby entry into the UK would be based on certain criteria, such as skills and qualifications. The Leave campaign wanted it, and the former UKIP leader Nigel Farage today spoke of backsliding. As for Theresa May's stated aim of a system offering more control, some scepticism here over whether she'll get it. Even though Theresa May said Brexit means Brexit?
Oh, Brexit means Brexit, but does Brexit mean curbing immigration? I don't know whether they're serious about it in a serious way, whether they'd be cutting numbers from outside the EU as well as within the EU. I don't know.
Now, naturally, people want to know what Brexit will mean.
In Westminster this afternoon, it was David Davis, now Brexit Minister, answering questions about the meaning of Brexit. Details, some would say, still conspicuous by its absence.
It means getting the best deal for Britain, one that's unique to Britain, and not an off-the-shelf solution. This must mean controls on the numbers of people who come to Britain from Europe.
What do we want? Brexit! And when do we want it? Now!
Meanwhile, for these demonstrators outside Parliament, the detail they were after was about timing. An immediate triggering of the process for EU withdrawal, their cry. The minister's view on that one, merely, it'll happen as soon as is reasonably possible.
Well, there was more good economic news today as key figures for the service sector of the economy showed their biggest monthly rise in 20 years. The Purchasing Managers' Index had fallen in July in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote, but bounced back in style last month. Well, our business correspondent Helia Ebrahimi is here. Tell us about the numbers.
Well, PMIs sound really technical, but it's a manager's index. It's basically people in companies that order stock, hire people, and the services industry is 80% of the UK economy. So this gives us a really good insight into business investment. Any number under 50 is bad, and you can see July, it really fell off a cliff. Any number over 50 is growth, it's good. Look at that, that's the best month-on-month growth in 20 years. And if we take a look at what this did to the pound this morning, you can see it shot up. That's the best number we've seen since July. It actually prompted a German lender, Deutsche Bank, to retract some of its bearish comments and say the new data that's coming out is food for thought. The other piece of data I wanted to show you is car registration. That's up 3.3% year on year for the month of August. Cars are really big ticket items, so it's a very good way of understanding how consumers are feeling about their finances. And this is an industry that's done very well over the past few years, and from June, it basically slumped, so it's been doing very well.
So this is early days still. What does it tell you about the economy as a whole?
The question everyone wants to know is, where is this recession that the Treasury predicted, that the Bank of England predicted? And I think people are starting to ease away from it. But let's have a listen in to what one economist had to say.
Back in July, the chance of recession was looking very high. Since then, we've had a central bank that's introduced more stimulus. We've had a new government that seems to be taking more concerted action. So business has revived, and it's now looking like there's a much reduced risk of recession.
The key thing to remember is that we had this massive stimulus package from the Bank of England. So it's unclear to know what would have happened if they didn't do this. But clearly that big shock and awe threat that people were talking about before the referendum isn't coming to fruition. The question will be, what happens in the medium term?
And we'll be asking. Helia, thanks very much. Cathy.
Thanks, Matt. Well, joining us now from Overton in Hampshire is the Conservative MEP, Dan Hannan, a member of the Vote Leave campaign team. And in the House of Commons is the Labour MP for Wolverhampton North East, Emma Reynolds, who voted to remain. Dan Hannan first. Let's deal with immigration before we come on to the economy more broadly. You described the Australian-style points system as eminently sensible. It ain't going to happen, according to the PM. Is she backsliding?
Well, it was a means to an end, the end being control over immigration, so that we decide for ourselves roughly who comes in and roughly in what numbers. Now, the Prime Minister has made very clear that that remains the objective. If she doesn't want to do it through a point system, there are other ways of getting there,
Okay.
and I'm very relaxed about how we do it.
Are you also relaxed that controlling immigration in whatever way means, as David Davis said today, that membership of the single market is improbable?
I mean, I think it's really important to stress this. The argument against membership of the single market, as against access to the single market, is not really anything to do with immigration. It's that it's bad for our economy to have to subject 100% of our firms to 100% of EU regulations when only 6% of British businesses do any trade at all with the rest of the EU. So it's a sort of separate issue from what our border control regime should be. It's
Right, so
about being
looser-
able to exploit the opportunities.
OK, and a looser kind of access is fine by you too?
Well, it's not to do with looser access. I mean, you know, look at what it says on the back of a smartphone, right? Manufactured in China, designed in California. Neither China nor the US has any trade deal with the EU, yet obviously we're still able to buy the products here. So virtually
Okay.
the whole world has access to the single market.
Well, let me put that to Emma Reynolds then. I mean, you accept now that some kind of curbs on free movement are inevitable. You've changed your mind on that. Do you also accept this kind of more limited access to the single market, not unfettered anyway, that Dan Hannan is talking about?
Well, I did campaign to remain in the EU, but I accept the outcome of the referendum, and I accept the fact that a majority of my constituents want to leave the EU. I do think that one of the principal reasons was immigration, therefore we do need to restrict the numbers coming in, and I'm confused really as to why the Prime Minister has ruled out a points-based system, because that is one way to reduce the numbers. Particularly you can rule out, for example, low-skilled workers, you can rule out specific workers that you don't want coming in, and then you can specify particular workers that you do need for the economy. So I think it is confusing that the Prime Minister has been so specific about this particular element of the negotiation.
But there may be other ways to skin a cat, as Dan Hannan says. But what about this issue of the single market? Are you happy with the fact that unfettered access to the single market might not be possible?
I don't think we will continue to have unfettered access to the single market, and I disagree with Daniel Hannan about the importance of that. However, we lost that argument. So one of the prices that we will have to pay for restrictions on immigration, which is something that Leave voters and also some Remain voters want, frankly, but one of the prices we'll have to pay is not such a good economic deal. Now, we need the best possible deal and the best possible access, but I think it is highly unlikely that we'll get the same access as we get today.
Dan Hannan, it's a price we'll have to pay, along with potentially, as we heard overnight, an exodus of Japanese companies, potentially, and obviously Britain going to the back of the queue for trade talks with the US. That's now clear that that will happen.
Well, actually, no, it's very clear that there isn't going to be a US-EU deal. As the German economics minister said last week, it's at an end. He was saying out loud what all politicians have been privately observing for months now.
And
so
Barack
at least we're
Obama
in a
is
queue,
still
because I think there is...
privileging. OK, but Barack Obama is still privileging some kind of deal with the EU, which could take forever, and then it's our turn.
OK, Cathy, I will offer £1 to €1 that there will be a US-UK trade deal in place long before there is a US-EU trade deal, if ever the second of those happens, because we're in a position now to have a genuinely consumer-led liberal free trade accord, not corporatist, not controlled by the cartels. We don't need to worry about French filmmakers and analog German companies worried about US tech competition and so on. We can have a properly effective trade deal with the US and indeed with South America, with Asia, with the Indian subcontinent, with Australia.
What about those Japanese companies walking out the door, potentially?
Well, what they've said is that they want to have continued tariff-free access to Europe, and no one on either side of the channel is seriously proposing that there will be tariffs between the UK and Europe. We can sit at the centre of a new global trading network, retaining free trade with our friends and allies in Europe, who will remain our friends and allies, but finally opening our markets to those developing countries, hugely to the benefit of British consumers.
Emma Reynolds, Dan Hannan can see the sunlit uplands just over the hill. Let's face it, you said not that long ago leaving the EU would damage our our economy and lead to less investment, fewer jobs, higher prices, higher mortgage rates. None of that has yet happened. You over-egged the fear, didn't you?
No, I think this process is going to be difficult, but I think the priority for all of us now is to try and bring the country back together and to attempt to secure the best possible deal. But this process is not going to be short and it's not going to be simple. The thing that Daniel Hannan often forgets to say in these sorts of discussions is that actually we're going to have to negotiate with the rest of the EU first on things like whether we have common external tariffs or not before we can conclude trade deals with other parts of the world. I would like us to do trade deals with
very short negotiation. Of course, we're not going to have the common external tariff. The whole advantage of leaving.
Well, the Prime Minister has said, Daniel Hannan, she hasn't made up her mind about that point.
Fuel will be cheaper, textiles will be cheaper, we will have huge opportunities, and the people who will benefit the most in Britain will be low-income families who spend the highest proportion of their income on food and other necessities, and in the process we will be doing more for Africa and India and the developing world than any amount of aid has done over the years, because we'll finally be offering these countries a fair chance to sell their produce into a developed market.
With respect to Daniel Hannan, he should listen to his government and his Prime Minister. She has said explicitly to the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, that she has not yet decided what she is going to do about the customs union and common external tariffs. So, you know, it's all very well the Leave side again saying what they want. They said in the referendum campaign that we would have £350 million extra for the NHS. They said that we would have a points-based system for immigration, and all of that has now been turned over by the current Prime Minister.
Emma Reynolds, Dan Hannan, thank you very much. I'm sorry, Dan, we'll have to leave it there.
Outside Europe. We need to be part of it.
Sorry, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Matt.
Thanks, Cathy. Truck drivers have reported nightly violence, trees chopped down to block roads, knives used to cut through tarpaulins, and threats to the drivers themselves. But today it was them bringing traffic to a halt around Calais as they led a protest calling for the closure of the jungle migrants camp where thousands wait, seeking to come to Britain. Well, our correspondent Fatima Manji is at the port of Calais tonight. Fatima, tell us exactly what's going on.
Well, it is frustration, Matt. Those on the protest feel that the Calais camp has gotten too large and that the levels of violence that some migrants are willing to resort to in order to illegally get to Britain has escalated, and they feel afraid. This isn't a new issue, though, and it's not just a local issue. There's a political backdrop, and the Calais camp has become a feature in the French presidential election campaign. Nicolas Sarkozy, Alain Juppé, two presidential candidates, have already said that they would like to see the Treaty of Touquet reviewed. That, very simply, is the process where British border officials can check passports here, and it means the Calais camp stays here rather than in Britain. And perhaps bowing to this political pressure, the French government has already decided to close the Calais camps. The question is when, and for some, it can't come soon enough.
They're calling it Operation Escargot. Farmers and lorry drivers moving at a snail-like pace to blockade a motorway they themselves are often held up on by migrants.
They walk across fields and destroy crops to reach the motorway. It's pure vandalism.
On foot, some 300 Calaisians demanding a date for the closure of the town's so-called jungle camp.
So this is where the two demonstrators are meeting. On one side you've got the farm vehicles, on the other people on foot marching across. That's a mixture of people from the town, businesses and the mayor and deputy mayor.
They say the town's image has been blighted and it's suffering economically.
The French government has shown they are unable to handle it. Let's do the mayor of Calais with the English government. I think it is time for Theresa May to come and find some solutions. You've got some lonely kids in the jungle. I'm fed up, to be honest, when I hear that it is a French problem to deal with.
One solution he offers up is building asylum centres in Kent.
People think you're racist. We're not racist at all. But come here, live one day or 1 week here. It can't stay like that because it's going to have a terrible end. People are going to move on their own because they feel desperate.
Patrice Depot owns a fleet of 200 lorries. He says just a few weeks ago, one of his drivers was attacked by 50 migrants who ripped through the roof.
It's like banditry.
They stop our trucks violently. It's very dangerous. We're not even going to England. But for them, any truck means England.
Meanwhile, at the camp itself, up to 10,000 continue living in squalor. They were warned not to leave today to avoid clashes with Calais protesters. 23-year-old Hussein from Afghanistan has applied legally to join his brother in the UK and so doesn't want to be identified. He explains why most here resort to jumping on lorries.
But a lot of people are doing it every night, aren't they?
Yeah, because they don't have another option. They have to do that. But it's very dangerous.
The stench of desperation is now exacerbated by food shortages, according to charities trying to help. Malik, who's also from Afghanistan, tells me people here are going crazy because of a lack of proper food and shelter. He's willing to be hit and pepper sprayed every night, believing even the risk of dying is better than a life lived here. They think in England lies salvation, and the inhabitants of this camp will keep trying to get there, even when they're being met with ever higher fences and ever more frustrated Calais residents.
Well, it's not just about the politics on this side of the channel. Back home in Britain, in Parliament today, the Labour MP Stella Creasy, who visited the Calais camps over the weekend, brought up the issue of unaccompanied children, saying they were being forced to sleep with strange men in tents and that Britain should be doing more to protect them. The Home Secretary Amber Rudd replied that Stella Creasy may be unwittingly encouraging traffickers to bring more children to the camps. So that's the political backdrop we're talking about when we discuss the issue of the Calais camps. And I think it's safe to say that the Deputy Mayor's suggestion, the Calais Deputy Mayor's suggestion of building asylum seeker centres in Kent instead of the Calais camps might not go down too well. Matt.
Indeed. Fatima, thanks very much.
Now, for some disabled people, stares, name-calling and harassment are a part of daily life. It's not always something you'd go to the police about, but the impact can still be very painful. Tomorrow, a report from the Equality and Human Rights Commission will say that disabled people are more worried about being the victim of crime than non-disabled people, and the fear is greater among those under 24. For the latest in our No Go Britain series, Victoria Wright has gone out to meet others like her, for whom discrimination is commonplace.
Being able to pop out to the shops, go to the pub and socialise with friends is something we can easily take for granted. But if you look or act differently because of your disability, the fear of being singled out by others can get in the way of going out.
I don't go to nightclubs. I don't really like going to pubs in the evening, late at night. I don't feel at ease when I'm going home in the evening when it's dark. I avoid all of that because I'm worried that I might be targeted because of how I look, and I might have people verbally abusing me or maybe physically attacking me.
A new report by the Equality and Human Rights Commission reveals that disabled people of all ages are more likely to worry about being a victim of crime than non-disabled people.
Yeah, it's always better when we're together.
Paige is a 23-year-old university student who was no stranger to a good night out.
Yeah, usually we have pretty tame nights, but sometimes that happens.
I told her about how my own experiences had left me feeling hypervigilant when I'm out at night, and she shared a story of what happened to her.
We decided to go out for a few drinks to one of our local nightclubs. And we were on the dance floor and we were having a dance and a chat, and I remember looking over to my left and seeing a group of guys staring at us, and I remember my friend going, "I definitely think he fancies me." We didn't really think anything of it. Carried on dancing, and then I remember a commotion kind of happening on the other side of the dance floor, and I turned to see a man sort of charging through the dance floor. Within a second of that, he punched me. The guy was shouting, "Cripple, what are you doing in this club?" I've been called that a lot of times, but the aggression with which it was said was something new to me. He got let off with a fine, and it was only £50.
This short moment of violence had a long-term effect on Paige's confidence.
Initially, I didn't even want to go outside. I didn't go out with my friends for a good couple of months. You know, parties and events I had to miss because I got panicky any time I was in a social situation.
It only needs one incident to leave you feeling anxious about when the next nasty confrontation will happen. But not all confrontations are physical.
You gotta fight for your right to party.
I have had a really horrendous experience trying to buy a pint in a pub. Now, I was told that I couldn't have one because I was too drunk.
Alex was refused service because the bar staff mistook his facial palsy for being under the influence.
When I went back and explained that I had a physical disability, I would have half expected them to go, "Oh, look, we're really, really sorry," not, "Well, we still wouldn't have served you." I just find that quite sad. Best on commentary, yes.
Alex took to social media to fight back.
There was a campaign called Serve Alex that actually trended on Twitter to try and raise awareness of people who might look slightly different, who want to go into a pub or anywhere else for that matter and get the free service.
So he organised a 300-mile pub crawl.
That was me at the end of my pub crawl. I would like to see actually all licensees and all owners of shops doing some mandatory awareness training for people with disabilities.
Life can be even harder for those with hidden disabilities. In fact, more than half of people with social impairments, like autism, worry about being a victim of crime.
Uh-oh, we're in trouble. Something's come along and it's burst our bubble.
Isaias is a bright and funny 7-year-old boy with severe autistic spectrum disorder.
Catch! No, catch!
He's not visibly autistic.
No, I had you!
So consequently, when you see the other side of him, full-scale meltdown, tantrum, stresses, anxieties, people's reaction is that you have a badly behaved child and evidently you must be a terrible parent.
Dr. Bubble!
Isaias. Usually a meltdown occurs because of the fact he's got over-anxious about something and he's not in control. And the minute he loses control, he wants control back. So he'll go into two modes, which is fight or flight.
I popped up. I popped the big bubble.
Although his meltdowns make going out a challenge, unsympathetic judgments from other people make it even more stressful.
Size.
We've been kicked out of a very big fast food chain twice. One of his favourite places to go is a local play centre. He'd had a meltdown inside one of the play tunnels, and I had this mother come over to me, and in front of my children she was incredibly aggressive, really rude, really, upset and abusive at me. For the first time ever, it really impacted on my son.
You're annoying.
He has refused to go back to that play centre just in case she is actually there.
One place Isaias does like to go is the beach.
Oh, I'm keeping a stone. Oh, it's so pretty.
Today, there's a meet-up with other families with autistic children who find it easier to tackle the public's negative attitudes when they are out as a group.
We, like all other disabled people, should be able to access everything that everybody else accesses. And we feel that we can't. We feel that we're unable to because of lack of tolerance. Even when it is explained, there's no empathy, there's no understanding, there's indifference. And can you leave, please?
Olu was born with cystic hygroma, which affects his face and speech. He experienced verbal abuse as he was growing up. In fact, disabled children aged 10 to 15 are twice as likely to be victims of crime as their peers.
So when you were out and about and people were treating you differently, what sort of things were they saying and doing? Do you mind me asking what sort of names they called you? I have a feeling they might be the same names that I was called as well.
I bet that you can't remember it. Do you think that's because in a way it sort of became normalised, that being called names became almost like a part of normal life for you, that you sort of in a way forget what people are calling you because it's so constant? Would you agree that that's sort of what happened?
Straight. I mean, for me, being stared at, how people doing double takes, kind of nudging each other and pointing, and or shouting things like, you know, oh, that woman makes me want to vomit, which is what I've had people kind of say when I've gone past. You know, they might seem relatively small. They might not sound what we would think of as a hate crime. But when you have a disability, all these little things, all these little moments of curiosity and awkwardness and hatefulness, they build up.
How is it that 4 years after the 2012 Paralympics, which was meant to change perceptions of disability for the better, are disabled people still being made to feel uncomfortable just for wanting to go out and about?
That was Victoria Wright reporting, and we'll have more films in our No Go Britain series over the coming days. Matt.
Now then, the embattled Labour MP Keith Vaz has made his first public appearance since being linked by a Sunday newspaper yesterday to the use of male prostitutes. He asked several questions of fellow MPs at the House of Commons on the first day of the parliamentary term, but his chairmanship of the Home Affairs Select Committee remains in question. Well, we can go now to our political correspondent, Michael Crick, who is in Westminster. So they put up a bit of a fight.
Yeah, most politicians in these circumstances would lie low. Not Keith Vaz. He came to the Commons chamber today, asked a couple of questions of ministers, including this one about Yemen, where he was actually born.
Three members of this House, the member for Portsmouth South, Walsall South and myself, were born in Yemen. Our fear is that Yemen is bleeding to death.
Now, frankly, Keith Vaz is in even bigger trouble tonight than he was yesterday after those revelations in the Sunday papers. The Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen has written to the Charity Commissioner, the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, asking them all to investigate yesterday's allegations. Then tomorrow he's due to meet members of the Home Affairs Select Committee to decide his future, whether he carries on permanently as the chairman, perhaps stands down as the chairman for a while. It's difficult to see him carrying on. And I've learnt today that the chairman of the Black and ethnic minority group within the Labour Party has been consulting colleagues about whether Keith Vaz should continue as their representative on Labour's National Executive Committee. They'll make a decision on that by tomorrow. Now, if Mr Vaz has to step down from Labour's NEC, where he's been a hugely powerful figure, that won't just be a blow to him, but also something politically, perhaps of an advantage to Jeremy Corbyn. It may tip the balance Mr Corbyn's way a bit. Meanwhile, here at Westminster tonight, the Parliamentary Labour Party held a meeting and decided that tomorrow they're going to have a ballot of all Labour MPs on whether to return to the system whereby Labour MPs elect the shadow cabinet. 5 years ago, Ed Miliband changed the system so that it became the leader who chose the shadow cabinet. He did that. Jeremy Corbyn's been doing that since. Well, they're hoping to reverse that, return the power to them. That'll be a blow if that happens, and it probably will, to Jeremy Corbyn, but it may have to be ratified by the NEC, and whether they do that could depend on whether Keith Vaz is still a member of the NEC.
Michael, thanks very much. Kathy.
Thanks, Matt. Now, as we heard earlier, the US and Russia have failed in their latest attempts to reach an agreement on a ceasefire in Syria. In its absence, the bloodshed continues with a series of 6 suicide and car bombs targeting government-held areas across the country, while regime airplanes with Russian support continued to bomb rebel-held areas. And just to warn you, this report from our chief correspondent Alex Thompson does contain images which you may find distressing.
Syria, always beautiful. The country's Ministry for Tourism put out this video to encourage holidaymakers just a few days ago. Heavily featured, the area around Tartus on the country's northern Mediterranean coast. This was Tartus today, however, hit by 2 bombs in the ongoing Syrian war. In all, at least 40 people were wiped out by 5 attacks in areas still very much under the government control, like Tartus. Islamic State, or Daesh, said they did it, and it's likely most were suicide attacks. But inland from these government areas relatively untouched by the war lie cities like Aleppo, the second biggest in Syria. This city bitterly fought over now since the summer of 2012. The Syrian army fighting in Aleppo and filmed by a government media team. They claim that areas are being retaken from the rebels and opposition districts are now coming back under government siege. It's exactly the ebb and flow of territory and the bloodshed international global leaders have been pledging for years to stop and have totally failed to do so.
I think we reach an understanding with each other and of the problems we are facing, but some technical details still need to be worked on.
But the likes of Putin, Obama, May, Hollande, Merkel don't get to see this close up in Aleppo. They don't see the bombed out house there today in the Al-Sukhari district, where 6 members of one family were, according to neighbours, trapped by a bombing. One, a young boy, finally pulled from the dusty, entombing concrete. En route to hospital, he was at least still alive.
Alex Thompson reporting. At least 24 people have been killed and more than 30 injured in 2 suicide bomb attacks in Afghanistan. The first bomb was detonated near the Defense Ministry in the capital, Kabul. Another struck as security services rushed to the scene. The Taliban have claimed the attack.
A child has died after being infected with E. coli after eating cheese in Scotland. The outbreak has been linked to a brand of blue cheese, Dunsire Blue, made by Lanarkshire-based Errington Cheese. 20 people were infected, causing 11 to be treated in hospital. All confirmed cases became unwell prior to the end of July. Residents and tourists have been forced to flee from homes and hotels across Spain's Costa Blanca holiday resorts after a series of fires. The fires broke out on Sunday afternoon and spread quickly, fueled by strong winds and dry conditions. Authorities said they believed arsonists had started 3 blazes near the popular holiday spot of Benidorm.
After the break, we meet Jay McInerney, the author of a series of novels telling through its characters the triumphs and the tragedies of New York City. Now, he's been criticised, or rather described, as the writer whose job is to make fun of New Yorkers behaving badly. Jay McInerney's work chronicles contemporary life in Manhattan, and his latest book catches up with a couple whose lives, in a way, mirror his own. When his first book, Bright Lights, Big City, became a hit in the 1980s, Jay McInerney was a founding member of the literary Brat Pack, which included other American authors like Donna Tartt and fellow bad boy Bret Easton Ellis. Ever since, he's been a big part of the Manhattan social scene that also stars on his pages, rubbing shoulders with the good and the great. Like New York itself, he's become gentrified. After a decade, he is still married to his 4th wife, publishing heiress Anne Hurst. And like his characters, he's swapped hard drugs for fine wines. He's now a wine columnist for Town and Country. Jay McInerney's latest book, Bright Precious Days, is the 3rd in a trilogy following characters who've experienced those pivotal moments which have marked his own life and indeed the life of New York. The stock market crash under Reagan, 9/11, and now in this book, the last crash and the advent of President Obama. Well, earlier I spoke to Jay McInerney and began by asking him about the America of today and whether, as a novelist, he could have invented Donald Trump.
I like to think that I'm a good enough novelist that I could have invented Donald J. Trump. I'm not entirely certain. You know, truth is stranger than fiction, and
often in American politics.
And he's about. I mean, I think one of the problems with inventing a Donald J. Trump is that you'd strain credulity.
Is that one of the things that drives Trump, that he is from the wrong side of the New York tracks? He's trying to prove himself in Manhattan, but he hasn't got any friends.
Yes, and honestly, I don't think, in a sense, he really hasn't. You know, I mean, this book, these characters, and for that matter, my life, spans various divides in New York, uptown and downtown, bohemian circles and society and Wall Street circles. And the curious thing is, to me, all these years that I've lived in New York, one never really sees him. He doesn't seem to be really part of any group. You know, these sort of uptown social circles are partly driven by a competitive philanthropy, which seems to be something that he's not involved in. In New York, you're considered a terrible failure to your class if you don't endow, you know, a hospital or a library or cure a disease. And I've never seen. I think one of the reasons he doesn't want to release his tax returns is because he is not a charitable person, and he doesn't seem to be a sociable person really either. This is a 400-page book about New York, which doesn't mention Donald Trump once.
Will he ever forgive you?
I hope he doesn't.
So you have two candidates, both from New York. I mean, one sort of more recently, but the other one born and bred in New York, or borough of New York. Your books are all about New York, and yet this election is about the soul of America that resides very much outside.
It's true. You know, I think if there were any geographic justice, New York would be located about 1,000 miles offshore, because it's not representative of the country at large, and it has to be admitted. And my own political enthusiasms and those of the characters in this book don't necessarily represent those of people who live in the middle of the country. And unfortunately, we're living at a moment of a real schism between those groups. You know, the middle class used to hold our country together, but unfortunately, it's shrinking.
And what's your political enthusiasm?
I'm a liberal, and I always have been. You know, of course, an American liberal is virtually a centrist in Europe or the UK.
Or a Bernie Sanders fan, perhaps?
I was very enthusiastic about the enthusiasm that he aroused. My children were like many young people, big Bernie Sanders supporters. It's a fascinating thing that he did. The idea that someone who calls himself a socialist could get so far in an American election is indicative of what a strange political year it is.
Is that one of the problems that you have with Hillary Clinton? Is that she's too much part of the establishment?
I think, unfortunately, that she has a lot of baggage, and I think that she's been careless of some of her associations and entanglements over the past 20 years, and it's coming to haunt her. I happen to believe personally that she's the most qualified
But no one's
candidate.
excited about the novelty of her gender in the White House, including you.
It's very strange. I think it's partly because she's been around so long that people
forget that she's a woman.
take her for good. They forget that she's a woman, exactly. But you know, I think she would be a good president. I don't think she's been a good candidate at all.
Jay McInerney, thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.
And we've run out of time. Thank you very much for watching. See you tomorrow.
Good evening.